Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Blade Runner 3, Replicant Night by K. W. Jeter. Chapter 10. A Spanish-language double bill was playing at the $1 Million Theater. The same movies had been playing there forever, or seemingly so. The management never changed the plastic letters on the marquee. They just let the red plastic letters fall off one by one, hitting the rain-soaked sidewalk and lying there like cryptic messages underneath the sizzling broken neon. The hot blue colors ran crazy on the wet street, reflected in every puddle and gutter, upside down and backwards. Who could tell? And legible as the fire-tinged storm clouds rolling across the LA night sky. Christ, thought Rick Deckard, this is a fake. A real good fake. Better than the sets and stages and all the other phony rigging at the outer Hollywood studios. As real looking as it had ever gotten there, with accurate rain piped over and drizzling down on walkable streets, colored with the same intricate lights and electricity. Still, all you'd had to do was look past the camera lenses and the show was over. Illusion shattered. This false Los Angeles was a better job. Dehydrated deities lived up to their advance billing, as far as he was concerned. No wonder people got into them, but it was still just as much a fake as any other. Perhaps even as much as the real one back on Earth. He looked up at the garish marquee as he walked down the center of the empty street. The effect of downing the beaker loaded with the colloidal suspension activated by a spoonful of the Sebastian packet's contents were still setting in on him. For a few minutes, though it was hard to gauge the passage of time in a place that didn't exist, he had been able to see both the hovel's interior, with the tap still dripping into the kitchen area sink, and the briefcase with Batty's voice lying on the table, and the lineaments of his pocket universe, like two photo transparencies laid on top of each other. He'd even been able to see himself, his legs sprawled out, his hand resting on the table beside the empty beaker he just slapped down, as another perception of his body, standing, not sitting, wearing the long pseudo trench coat he'd always affected in LA, had disorientingly faded into his consciousness. The Deckard body sitting in the hovel on Mars had faded out. The first thing in that other universe to go. The one in the pocket universe had tilted his head back, getting the gray-tinged rain in his face and seeing past the roiling clouds to sectors of hard-edged, needle-tipped stars, with gouts of flame bursting beneath them. Deckard figured the stars were as fixed in place as the heavy, dark clouds, indicators of this LA's eternal night. Dicking around with time like that was the main indicator of the pocket universe's fake status. A night that never ended, though the real LA had often felt like that to him, and little anachronisms. Right down to the $1 Million marquee above his head. That was a fragment from the past, something vanished from the real world. This whole 10-block sector of the city's decaying downtown had been leveled by urban renewal terrorists to drive out the last squatter tribes sometime after Deckard and Sarah had gone off-planet. News footage of the mini-nuked buildings had shown up on the Martian cable's nightly clown rap, even on the tiny video screen in the hovel. He'd been able to recognize the old movie places, the old movie palaces curling ornaments, lifeless and unlit in the rubble. The news clip hadn't shown the old Bradbury building, across from the transplanted theater, or what had been left of it. Deckard had assumed that even if there'd been no explosive charges planted there, the concussion from the surrounding blasts would have knocked the structure over. The place had been falling into plaster dust and splintering support beams when he'd been inside it. All the old, intricate wrought iron balustrades and open stairwells, the clanking antique of an elevator and its cage, the grand fabric of early 20th century business enterprise, fallen on hard times. The building had looked like some kind of vertical mausoleum when he'd tracked the last of his quarry in there. The replicant baddie and the psychotic would-be replicant Pris. He'd gotten the shit kicked out of himself there as well, by Pris and the non-human Batty in turn. But as somebody else had said an even longer time ago, the race wasn't always to the swift. They had died and he was still alive, both in this world and the other one, the real one. Though he didn't feel too swift at the moment, a wave of nausea rolled up in his throat, the hallucinated city street blurring and thinning to insubstantiality for a few seconds. The colloidal suspension, the DT stirred from a dry powder to a potentiated liquid, was still asserting its hold on his central nervous system. His perceptions, what his flesh and mortal eyes were gazing upon inside the hovel, were being overridden by what Sebastian saw. After all, thought Deckard, it's his world, whatever he was now. Deckard turned away from the movie theater and toward the building directly across the street. It looked the same as what he'd seen it last, in the real world, in the real L.A., complete with the fat-bellied swirling columns that had been grafted onto the original structure in an ill-advised attempt to evoke some kind of pseudo-Arabic multiculturalism, and that had only resulted in the same kind of bastard kitsch the city had always been known for. The other added ornamentation was the wadded-up trash in the entranceway. The same rain-soaked pile of unidentifiable rubbish that the wet winds stacked up against every Angelino doorway. He picked his way through the mess, greasy food wrappers tangling against his ankles, then drifted away to the empty, glistening street. That was the other fake thing, even more so than the sets up in the outer Hollywood station. At least there, extras had crowded the station, simulating the restless urban population. Here, in Sebastian's pocket universe, the streets were devoid of any human or close to human activity. As depopulated as this zone had been in the real L.A., there had still been some life stirring about, even if only dwarf scavengers climbing over his police spinner, trying to unbolt the roof-mounted air filters. If this place was Sebastian's show, he'd made it a private one. Believers only, thought Deckard, or at least just communicants. The little guy had obviously never had much use for other people, or at least not for anything other than the autonomic toy friends he'd manufactured for himself, and Pris, but that had been true love. Deckard shoved the building's front door with the flat of his hand. It swung into darkness. The colored light from the movie theater marquee seeped past him, picking out small details. Brass handrails still recognizable under layers of dirt and tarnish. Rain puddling and spilling from one open floor to the next in the cavernous space. He stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind him, sealing out the street sector of the hallucinated world. He stood in the middle of the space, looking upward. What he saw produced a partial smile, one constructed of both irony and grudging admiration. Too perfect, thought Deckard. Through the building's broken roof, past the levels of iron-grilled walkways, beams of shifting light penetrated the darkness like the radiance of magnified stars falling from the fixed spheres in which this little world was enclosed. The lights came from the blimp, the old UN advertising vessel with its billboard view screen and spiky antennae, looking as if though it were some kind of sea creature that had inflated itself enough to rise up in the air. Squinting against the slants of light, Deckard could just barely see the blimp's shape cruising in absurd majesty above the building and the surrounding streets. The Euro hybrid geisha face on the view screen, smiling with a mute guardian angel's uncommunicable wisdom. Sebastian had brought that back as well, another fixture for his pocket universe. In the real world, the real LA, the blimp was gone, taken out by a mortar round from Rep Simp fringe terrorists. Deckard himself had seen the blimp go down in flames. A later day Heidenberg. Something even the most blaze or stoned LA citizens had their attention caught by. A non-event for Sebastian, though. He'd already been living out in the sideways zone's wasteland with his patched-together Pris, so he'd missed all that. This urban concoction was the LA that Sebastian had known before he'd left. Rain from the building's leaking roof sluiced down the brass handrail that Deckard grasped. As he looked up the flight of stairs, their treads rotted to creaking sponges. His other hand moved inside his coat. From force of habit, old ingrained cop ways, as well as from the memory of when he'd been here in long ago reality. His fingers were searching for his gun, that great black metal weight, a hammer as big and effective as a cannon. They found nothing but lint and a rip in his shirt, through which his sweat-moist flesh could be felt. He drew his hand back out, empty. He would have felt better with even a hallucinated weapon in his grasp, but he wasn't surprised that such things had been edited out of Sebastian's universe. The last traces of the other world, the hovel where his real body was sitting without consciousness, blindly watched over by the talking briefcase, had faded away. This world had locked in tight. He could feel the wet steps yielding beneath, the rails' cold metal chill against his palm, the smell of rust and crumbling plaster, the stink of decades-old pigeon shit mired in his breathing. A mist-smeared shaft of light from the blimp above the building crossed over his face, then cut a diagonal through the empty lobby he'd left behind. "Sebastian!" he called out, voice loud in the building's silence, as he mounted to the floor where the genetic engineer had kept his suite of rooms. Deckard looked down the open walkway to the tall double doors, one of them pushed slightly ajar. No answering voice came. From somewhere past the doors, a wavering light fell, as though from a lit candelabra. "Anybody there?" He knew there had to be. As empty as the building felt with its vacant spaces and nailed-down shadows, there was still another human presence inside it, or something slightly different from human, something embedded in the walls and pockmarked floor tiles. "You're walking around in his head," Deckard told himself, "or as good as. Remember that." At the double doors, halfway down the walkway, the silence was broken by a drip of rain into the puddle that had formed in front of the sill. The water rippled like a softly broken mirror as Deckard stepped into its center and pushed one of the doors all the way open. Flickering candlelight brushed against his face as he gazed across the high-ceilinged room within. Toys. He remembered them from that time when he had tracked Pris and the replicant Batty to this spot. There had been a pocket universe for Sebastian even then, a little world that he had created for himself. And this place was it, his refuge, a child's refuge, from the hurtful, bustling world of grown-ups, everybody bigger than him. Everybody who wasn't dying from a galloping progeria. The accelerated decrepitude that had turned him into a wrinkled, fading non-adult. L.A. wasn't a city for children. No wonder Sebastian had been dying in it. If he hadn't built this hiding place for himself, his small corpse would have been trampled in the streets. Past the candles, guttering in their branched silver settings, Deckard saw torn, gauzy curtains drifting in an unfelt breeze, their ragged ends trailing across the nearest mannequins and stuffed animals. Whatever contents of Sebastian's head hadn't spilled out to re-envision the LA street and the decaying building were exposed here, like some soft, babyish army. Glass eyes stared at nothing, or were reflected in glint mirrors with ornate frames. The inert photoreceptors switched off, or robbed of batteries, when Pris, on the run with the escaped replicants she had thought she was one of, had disguised herself as one of Sebastian's mechanical creations. A leotarded bridal doll with a veil draped over her straw-like hair. She had finally achieved the non-human apotheosis her cracked brain had been seeking all along. To be a thing, a killing thing, or a loved one, it didn't matter. One of the mannequins stirred, fat clown of ambiguous gender. It croaked out a woman's laugh as the rubbery wattled neck shook, white painted face tilting back. Stubby fingers pawed the air like pale anemones brought up from ocean shallows. Deckard halted in the center of the room, forcing his breath to a measured pace, pushing back an emergent claustrophobia. The place would have seemed uncomfortably close, crammed with too much junk. Disassembled tube radios and thrift shop antiques and Patzer chess pieces, all the hobby collectibles of a perpetually dying too clever child. Even if there hadn't been unpleasant memories filling up the unoccupied areas. He'd come close to getting killed here, twice in rapid succession. First by Crazy Priss, then by the even loonier replicant baddie. The human original he'd met up with later, the one whose cerebral contents were stored in the talking briefcase, had been a piece of cake by comparison. His fingers ached, not just for the want of a soothing gun, not that the real weapon had been much use here, but from old wounds. The replicant baddie had broken fingers as easily as snapping twigs. The fingers had healed badly, aching when provoked by shifts in weather or the pressure of memory. The laughing clown's barking noise suddenly shrilled up another octave, the rubber hands jerking even more spasmodically above the fright-wigged head. Deckard stepped away from the device, watching as a shudder of ill-meshed gearing ran through its frame. The clown suddenly froze, the garish face paralyzed in a rictus of manic hilarity. The room's silence congealed once more as a wisp of black, burnt rubber smoke trailed out of the parted mouth. Another face appeared, popping up from behind the stricken clown. "Oh, hi." The black cloth covering the device's workings was draped over Sebastian's shoulders, his moist-eyed gaze still set in the wrinkled flesh of his aging disease, blinked at Deckard. "I didn't hear you come in. I was busy working on this old thing, trying to get it running again." He laid a wrinkled, protective hand on the clown's shoulder. "It's a real keeper. Used to be in an old amusement park and stuff." "No, it didn't." Deckard shook his head. "It's not even real. Nothing here is." "Well, yes and no." Grease marked Sebastian's hands. He rubbed them against his trousers. "Real in the platonic sense." With an extended forefinger, he poked at one of the clown's eyes, getting its line of vision to match the other. "This is the idea of the physical manifestation of what came from the amusement park. Ideas are real things, too." Sebastian's voice went on the defense. "Just as much as all that stuff, out there." He nodded toward the room's high, arched window, but it was clear that he meant some place farther away than the visible street. "Where you just came from." "That's why it's called the real world," said Deckard, "and this isn't." He gestured toward the other man. "In the real world, you didn't have legs. Not anymore." "Yeah," Sebastian nodded slowly. "I had to get rid of them." "Out there." His expression brightened. "But here, 'cause this is my world. I figured I should have them again, and I was right. They come in real handy." "Should have given yourself a second pair of arms. Be even more convenient." "Oh, they told me I could do that if I wanted." "Who's they?" Deckard peered closer at the short-statured image. A matter-of-fact response came from Sebastian. "The Repsims. When they did this for me. You know what they call dehydrated?" Only it's not dehydrated at all. That's just a slang term. Same way with being a deity. I don't feel like one. He smiled shyly. I just feel like myself. The fact that they were able to do me over, to take what was left of me and turn it into a polymerized sensorial override encapsulate. That's the technical term for the process. It doesn't change anything, real or not. Deckard gazed around the overstuffed room, then back to his host. There's one big difference here, he said quietly. You don't have to die here, the way you were on the outside. Well, I could if I wanted to. Anything's possible. Sebastian placed a hand against the front of his coveralls. I could make this whole body go away. I mean, I could just crumple up and blow out the window like dust. But... He looked across the silent dolls and toys. There's enough of me left in all this. It's all me, actually. So I guess I'd still be here. In spirit, kinda. Sebastian frowned, as though trying to puzzle the situation out. Like that old bit. Did you ever hear about it when you were a kid? About splitting an apple and finding God in the seed? So maybe I am some kind of deity. Like all those genuine name brand ones that you get in those little packets, huh? Deckard felt sorry for him, the same as he had long ago, in the real world. Yeah, maybe you are. You should have seen it though, when I first got here and I was joking around and stuff. The moist eyes glittered with excitement. I made myself 10 feet tall. Always wanted to be. A forefinger pointed up. Hit my head on the ceiling though, so it wasn't really practical. Guess I could have made the room bigger, though, but then it wouldn't have been the same as before. And that was the way I wanted it. Just the same, and with my little friends too. He shouted past Deckard. Hey, Colonel! And Squeaker! Come on out here! We've got company! A glance over his shoulder, and Deckard saw two even smaller figures. An ornately uniformed teddy bear and a long-nosed toy soldier. Waddle marching from one of the other rooms. The bear's button eyes fixed on Deckard with evident suspicion. The soldier's spine went rigid, as though the automaton was considering its course of action. Now, come on, fellas, be nice. Sebastian waggled his finger, stained with black grease at them. Mr. Deckard isn't going to do anything to hurt us. He can't anyway, even if he wanted to. Least, I don't think he can. The watery eyes peered at him. Can you? Deckard shook his head. No, not anymore. The toy companions weren't convinced. The bear emitted a soft growl. Fool, said the soldier. He's not a nice man. I'm sure, Colonel, he's as nice as he can be. Mr. Deckard hasn't had as easy a life as we have, as I have. Tilting his head to one side, Sebastian regarded his guest thoughtfully. He doesn't have real good friends like I do. He's all alone, aren't you? Not alone enough. Time might not be ticking along in this room like everything else. That might have been left outside in the real world. But Deckard knew that there was at least one other person waiting for him somewhere. Unfinished business. His mutual fate with Sarah Tyrell still to be worked out. But I can deal with it. A shrug from Sebastian. Suit yourself. That's your pocket universe, the one inside your head. What about you? The other's low-rent holiness had irritated Deckard, bringing out a mean streak he didn't feel like concealing. "Your little buddy's really enough company for you." "Sure." Sebastian looked suddenly nervous, picking up on the edge of hostility in the dust-motted air. "They always were. They had to be." "What about Pris?" Deckard felt his own thin smile appear. "Where's she?" The childlike innocence flashed out of Sebastian's face, as though the switch on one of his mechanical toys had been thrown, replaced by something both hotter and darker that could be seen like black enameled metal at the center of the man's eyes. "That's not any of your business, Mr. Decker." His hard, annihilating stare could have bored holes through real-world skin and flesh. "You don't have any right to ask about that." "Just a simple question." Deckard's turn to give a shrug. "You don't have to answer. It's your world, remember?" That world trembled in sympathetic connection to its creator. Plaster dust sifted from a network of cracks that suddenly shot like negative lightning across the water-stained ceiling. The crystal attachments to the candelabra and unlit chandeliers rattled, as though the fault lines beneath the real LA had been duplicated here. "Stop!" Another voice shrilled from the opposite side of the room. "Stop that!" The toy soldier shook his tiny fists in the air, as high as the point on his spiked helmet. "Let him alone!" Beside the soldier, the uniformed teddy bear stamped its feet, anger sufficient to have caused this earth's tremors. "Wicked, wicked, wicked!" "No, fellas. Don't." Face wet with tears, Sebastian held one palm outward as he sank into a carved wooden chair. "It's all right." The teddy bear attacked first, the tassels of its epaulets shaking as it locked stubby arms around Deckard's leg, the round face nuzzling a muffled growl against the long coat's lower edge. Deckard peeled the animated creature from himself, hoisting it up just long enough to pitch it against the approaching toy soldier. Both of Sebastian's automatons sprawled into a corner. The soldier burst into whimpers of frustration. "Don't hurt them!" Leaning forward, Sebastian grabbed hold of Deckard's sleeve. "It's not their fault. They're just doing what I programmed them to. They're just trying to protect me." Deckard looked down at the weeping man. "From what?" An old, deeply buried cop circuit linked inside Deckard's brain, producing the almost shamefully cruel satisfaction that came with doing the job well. This might have been Sebastian's world, his little private pocket universe, but Sebastian didn't control it any longer. "I do," thought Deckard. Things had to be broken before the things they concealed could be seen out in the open. Now he could find out what he needed to know. "Protecting you from what?" Sebastian took a deep, shuddering breath, drawing himself upright. "Oh, everything, I guess. I don't know." He made a visible effort to calm himself down, the fragile body parts drawn together by an invisible string. "Nothing, really." His trembling fingers wiped the last tears from his eyes. He looked up at Deckard. "I mean that. From nothing. She's not here." "Pris? Why not?" "I just don't know." Sebastian morosely shook his head. "I tried to make her be here, you know? The way I made Colonel Fuzzy and Squeaker Hussar just be the way they were before." He pointed to the bear of the toy soldier, who had sullenly withdrawn into a corner of the room. I should have been able to do that. This is my world, isn't it? The rep simps put me here. They made me a dehydrated deity. They gave me all this. I should be able to have what I want, shouldn't I? I suppose so, Deckard nodded. Whatever you want. But I just couldn't make it be that way. I tried and tried, but it just wouldn't happen. That's really why I didn't change anything. Why I kept it all the way it was before. Look. Sebastian jumped up from the chair, ran to one of the tall windows, and yanked its gauzy curtain to one side. I got that right, didn't I? His fingers stabbed toward the dark, rain-drizzled urban landscape below. That's the street, isn't it? Just the way it was. Another slow nod from Deckard. And all this, the building and everything. The small man turned around in the center of the room, hands upraised to indicate all its contents and the spaces beyond. I know I got all this right. I lived here so long. Not here, but out there, out in the real world. This was my world. I just had to make it all over again. And I did. Deckard watched him and listened. He felt even sorrier for the poor little bastard. He's finding out the same things that Deckard had found out. He learned and written on the charred scroll of his heart. There were some things you couldn't bring back. You could grieve for them, and that was all. But Pris, Sebastian looked puzzled, as if he was about to start crying again. When I got done, she still wasn't here. She was supposed to be. I made it that way, but she wasn't. Deckard knew why Sebastian, the deity of this pocket universe, had failed. He wondered if he should tell him. I tried and tried. Look, said Deckard, it's not going to happen. Why don't you just give up on that? You've got your memories. Those'll have to do. A big sigh from Sebastian rendered him even smaller and more fragile. I know you're right. His shoulders slumped in desolation. He looked hollowed out, insubstantial, as though the contents of his skin had been converted to loose atoms and exhaled. Another night breeze coming through the windows might have blown him away entirely. There's a reason for it. Why she's not here. You don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. That's not why I came here. Of course not. You've got important business to take care of. Still. Sebastian turned back to the silent and motionless clown mannequin. He lifted the black cloth covering its mechanical innards. From one of his coverall pockets, he took a yellow-handled screwdriver and poked at the meshing gears. Like I said, I know why. Or to put it another way, kinda, it's because of what I don't know about Pris. He extracted some small part from the workings and studied it between his thumb and forefinger. I mean, I know all about something like this, and all the other stuff I got. Still holding the metal piece, Sebastian gestured toward the room's contents, and the building, and the street outside, and the whole city even. I know what those are. So I've got them the right way inside my head so I could make them be here the way they were before, out there. You know, in the real world, but with Pris. He leaned close to the clown's workings, screwing the little part back into place. I thought I knew what she was, but maybe I was wrong. Deckard said nothing. For a moment, the room and all the empty spaces around it were silent, except for the touch of rain upon the window glass and the corridor's pools of dark water. Do you think, Mr. Deckard, that that's possible? Sebastian's gaze, sharper beneath the constant moistness, like a knife under blurry water, fastened onto him. You think I could have got it all wrong?